The problem with drawing up laws is that they create boundaries. It's all right in the middle of the law, this shall not be done, but most of the time, laws are not about universal situations. They're about cases. We've seen that in our first reading from Exodus. If you lend money to any of my people who are poor. So a situation, a case is set out. But that means that that's all right when it's very clear that this case obtains. But most of the time, you have to establish that this is really what is going on with law. Is the law applicable? We've seen in our own times very recently how with the introduction of the restrictions on our lives to help us combat the COVID virus, how sometimes we get ridiculous situations of one side of a street being under the restrictions and the opposite side of the street not being. But you will always get these. You will always get borderline cases, because if you have a law that applies in a case, then as soon as it stops applying, no matter how close to the original case, then you get this sort of ridiculousness, this borderline situation. It's interesting in this case to note that in particularly returning to the ancient Near East, how ancient Near Eastern law codes, which do set out quite in detail sometimes what one should do in particular cases, in the huge amount of case and applications and court procedures that have been uncovered from the ancient Near Eastern social situations, how the law codes, these great law codes, are never, ever referred to. Because, I suppose, in application, in people coming before a court, the court needs to see, well, what's happening here? What's happening in this particular dispute, in this particular situation? Might then understand why throughout its history, particularly in the Jewish practice, how the Torah, the law of God, is a source of constant study. That is a virtuous practice in itself. In fact, to set aside everything else and to study the law is the best thing, the most righteous and good thing that one can do. And this constant study has produced in further sets of law. The halakha, which is a way of describing both the oral law and the written law and practice of Judaism in different times. And you can even see in times of Jesus the customs of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, different philosophies, different ideas about how one is to be righteous, because law is not straightforward in this case. I think this is partly specifically with the Torah, because it's either very general, thou shalt not kill, but then one might say, well, who, as we go on in the history of the Old Testament, there's quite a lot of killing going on. So who is it meant that we don't kill? So it's either too general, or it's very specific, as we see again in this passage we had from the book of Exodus, but also one I thought of was from the prophet Haggai, when the Lord himself says to Haggai, put this question to the priests: if you carry some meat in your clothes that's consecrated and your clothes touch something else, does that become consecrated? All of these sorts of things that arise from the fact that you can't have a law for every situation. I suppose that's why Jesus advises that we avoid going to court. That's in the Sermon on the Mount, when we're talking about putting down something that we're going to offer on the altar, and we need to be reconciled with our brother, lest he take us to court, because we don't want to end up there. It suggests then that this isn't the way to think about following God's will. That the Torah, that the law, that the Pharisees, that the Sadducees come and pose Jesus a test is not the way to think about following God's will. Certainly in the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 5, Jesus challenges us to go further than God's commandments. You have heard it said, thou shalt not kill, but I say to you this. And that suggests then that what the Torah, the law of God, is given to us for is not about legal requirements that are just for the good order of society. And so when we're thinking of the test that the Pharisees put to Jesus, the lawyer puts about the Great Commandment, and Jesus' own opinions on the law, I think we always must have, particularly in Matthew's Gospel, we must always have the Sermon on the Mount teaching in the background. So the greatest commandment, or the Great Commandment, it's difficult to know what this means, and that might be part of the test. It's certainly not a new question. I think perhaps it seems that rabbis were often posed this question, perhaps to test their orthodoxy or perhaps to genuinely get an answer, since some of them do seem to be trivial or to be very specific and even related to a time before the first century when the Pharisees are disputing with Jesus, and some seem so general. So perhaps part of the test is, what does it mean to have a commandment that's greater than the others, if all are given by God? Now, Jesus seems to take the question to mean, what is the interpretative principle? What is it that helps us to bring the law to life? To mean, how does this law apply today, as it were? How do we apply it in a way that no ancient Near Eastern law was ever applied? I think why I think that Jesus seems to take it to mean this is by his use of the word depend, is the translation, or literally to hang. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So it's not so much about the law, which is the best law, which is the lawiest law, one might say, but about the fulfillment, about how best to do the law, to follow the will of God, which is ultimately what the commandments and the statutes and the ordinances that the book of Deuteronomy particularly goes on about. It's about doing God's will so that we may have life. It's not so much about the law then, these two commandments, but about the fulfillment of the law. The love of God and neighbour is the fulfillment. And it's this word hang. On it hang all the law and the prophets. Just to mention here, and it may be reading too much into it, or may not be important, but the word hang is the same word, the same as in English, that St. Peter uses to describe how the Jews had, and the people of the society had hung Jesus on the tree. Maybe that's overreading it, though. But the talk of fulfillment about the law, it's not so much about the law, it's about the fulfillment of the law, sends us again back to the Sermon on the Mount. Think not, Jesus says, before he introduces these, you have heard it said, but I say to you, and goes through some of the 10 Commandments there even. Before that, he prefaces that with saying, think not that I have come to destroy the law and the prophets. I have not come to destroy them, but to fulfill them. One might say, to show the way that the commandments of God give life. And finally, the similarity here between what is said today, Jesus says to the Pharisees today in the shadow of the temple, and what he says in Galilee on the Sermon on the Mount about the law, is he doesn't just talk about the law, he talks about the law and the prophets. Love is on what they both hang: the history of the people, the history of life, the story. The whole story of God's relationship with us hangs on love. And this is shown in Christ, who hung upon the tree.